Book 2, Chapter 2.
Mecha.
The scattered beams of light that broke through the overhang of trees and vines slowly departed. They would not return until the next morning. As the darkness grew, the forest came to life. Things cried out, lonely sounds, angry sounds. To David they meant nothing. All he knew was Mommy was gone, and he had to find a way back to her. Animals that scavenge under the cover of darkness, busy snuffling things, nosed their way past him. He is not food. He is not danger. He is not even alive. Not on the outside, anyway. He's Mecha now. Before tonight, he may have been a boy. His mommy may have loved him. But tonight, that illusion came to a crashing close. He wanders alone now, a sad little figure roaming the dark wilderness, with a toy teddy bear struggling to keep up beside him. He's not cried in some time. He stopped actually after Mommy's car sped from the forest and out of his life. The crying is, after all, a programmed device. After some time, his logic takes over. He knows he cannot follow her. She said that they would destroy him. He knows destroy. He does not know they. But that doesn't matter now. He knows that she would not take him back even if he did find a way home. All of this his creators would have expected his advanced logic circuits to tell him. But there is a piece of reasoning that comes from someplace new in his head. It comes from the same place where Mommy's eternal image burns inside. It is something not quite planned or expected. David spoke this to Teddy as they coursed slowly through the dark forest. If I'm a real boy, then I can go back. And she'll love me then. Teddy filtered this through his own old-fashioned reasoning device as he struggled through the brush and over the moss-covered ground. How? Is what he finally asked when he could not make sense of David's idea. David was quiet as he thought of a response. Something flitted by him then, some flying thing. It zipped quickly to and fro in the darkness. It might have gone undetected by Orga eyes and ears. His night eyes traced its progress until he could see it no more. These living things, what was it they pursued? If he could only understand. The blue fairy made Pinocchio into a real boy, he said to Teddy. She can make me into one too. I will find her. I will become real. This logic sounded reasonable enough to the toy bear. Where is the blue fairy? He asked. I don't know, David answered. But there must be someone in the whole wide world who knows where she lives. This logic sounded good enough to both of them, though for different reasons. To Teddy because it was consistent. To David because his new mind was already engaging in that all-too-human trait of self-defensive reasoning. He simply had to find the blue fairy. If he could not find the blue fairy, he could never be a real boy. If he could never be a real boy, then Mommy would never... His mind wouldn't finish that thought. They walked quietly for some time. Occasionally there would be the sound of clanking metal in the brush beyond them, but neither of them saw whatever might be causing the sound. It was unimportant anyway. David was more concerned with the blue fairy. How on earth would he go about this search? He'd never even been away from Mommy's house since he'd been... born? Should he just approach people and ask if they knew? Mommy had told him to stay away from Orga, that only Mecha were safe. But what if the blue fairy was Orga? What then? He realized that this was going to be a complicated task. Then he saw the light. At first it was just a dim glow against the leaves and trees and bushes surrounding them. But it grew slowly in brightness, casting shadows about them, and something else was happening. Some new growl had started low in the dark. It grew slowly with the light, describing some unknown menace. What manner of creature could this sound announce? An Orga child would have been terrified, would have fled in fright. But the night creatures here have shown no taste for Mecha, so David only became curious. The sound grew in intensity. It was coming closer. Teddy had noticed it too. Then finally, they saw the thing. The dead of the forest is home to the decaying remnants of what was once the outskirts of a glorious civilization. Shanties and ghost towns line the long empty roads, places the Swintons and their peers would never acknowledge or even know about. These buildings are not empty, though. They are alive with small societies of forgotten people, trying to eke out an existence on the meager subsistence the forest allows. They construct their own lives out here, away from the laws and hypocrisies of the mainstream of America, or what remains of America. They are undesired, and undesiring of the way of life that has been denied them. Nor are they alone, these Orga that occupy the fallen halls of broken townships. There are others. They roamed the forest too. They were there that night. They had seen him earlier, this little one wandering aimlessly with his toy. He was Orga, wasn't he? Certainly he must be, from the look of him. Was he lost? Where were his mother and father? Certainly he was too young to be alone in the forest, and the teddy bear was obviously insufficient to protect him against the threats that faced little boys in the wild. It was all too well known how the Orga cherished their children, being allowed so few. Perhaps he was an illegal child. Many of the parents of unsanctioned children fled with their offspring from the cities and centers of commerce. This was all possible, yes, but the watchers did not talk to the little one or follow him. There would have been nothing to say, so they watched him pass and went about their own business. Occasionally one of them would make a noise while moving, or perhaps a piece of one of their bodies would fall off and clunk to the ground. But the little one and his toy did not seem to notice, or not to care. The forest was safe. It was well away from the centers of Orga population, so they could stay here, safe from detection, which could lead to destruction. But here there were no replacements for broken limbs, missing eyes, or malfunctioning ears. Old batteries were running low. There were those among them built before the self-lubricating joints and epidermal coatings had become commonplace. They needed oils. They needed flesh. Some required a faceplate, and even legs with which to run, because that is what their existence had become. A constant flight. A flight for survival. In the dead of the forest, they too heard the moan of some night beast approaching. Fascinated, they gathered from their dark hiding spaces to see what this was, and they too witnessed its arrival. "What is it, David?" Teddy asked the boy who was taller and could see easily over the brush. But David did not know. Its lights penetrated the gloom, and the shadows it cast grew against the trees behind them. It was getting louder, coming closer, until at last it stopped, just meters away from where they were standing. This was no beast. It was a vehicle of some kind. In the light, David could see now that there was a pathway of worn earth that the thing rode on, and before it lay a shallow pit. As they watched, the back of the vehicle began to rise slowly, and things began to crash down from the mouth of it. Was this garbage? Was this where the garbage from the Orga houses was left? Somehow it did not seem a right place for it. The pile grew noisily. A glittering metallic din filled the forest as the thing emptied its belly. When it was finally empty, the thing started backing away, its groaning engines complaining as the gears changed. It had moved back some distance when David and Teddy walked out from the trees to observe the contents of the pit. There were arms in there. There were legs in there too. And faces. Faces? Wires wound through the mess like veins. What was this? Then, as if in answer, they arrived. They came from the forest quickly, leaving the safety of their hiding places, running, jumping into the pile of metal debris. Some of their old and deteriorating bodies were whirring and clanking as they ran to beat the others to the treasure. Some of them weren't designed to run, so they lumbered to the pile, resentful of their better-designed companions. A few of them dragged themselves on worn and rusted arms. There were those that had been damaged by wandering Orga boys with nothing better to do. There are those who had been discarded after being damaged in the line of some duty to ungracious masters. One had even been left here after saving an Orga girl child from a fire. Its only reward had been to escape the salvage pit and roam the wilderness, damaged beyond use. They were the new slaves of mankind, those designed and built specific to fill the niche in humanity that humans did not anymore. They were Mecha, the robot class, custom built and disposable. None of them noticed the small Orga-like boy and his furry friend watching the struggle for parts in the pit. Nor did they notice the other who watched them. He was slim and quick-footed, his features handsome and smooth. He needed nothing from the pit. Joe's trek had been halting and slow. He'd had to stop and hide every time he saw Orga cruisers moving through the streets. Many of the drivers had been drunk and yelling about the flesh fair. Joe was not completely aware of this fair. He'd heard tell of it, but was not sure what manner of Orga festival it might be. It did not, however, seem like a thing for Mecha. In his flight, he had seen a group of young Orga jump from a cruiser and topple an old silver Mecha that had been replacing broken street lamps near the outskirts of the city. The laughing boys had kicked the fallen robot and broken bottles against his cowering, dented frame before jumping into their cruisers and fleeing. Joe did not go to assist. This looked like trouble. Bad trouble. Joe had bad enough trouble of his own. Check that. Time to go. He'd fled into the darkness as the broken robot's alarm went off to alert its owners of a problem. Eventually he'd made his way out of the populated areas. Around him the forest grew dense, and wild things began to screech in the night. He had heard of a place where discarded and runaway Mecha roamed freely. A place where desperate and diseased Orga occupied old abandoned towns. Illegal children and criminals supposedly hid there too. He would find this place. Perhaps one there, one programmed to be smarter, would know what he should do. As he climbed an incline, Joe had seen lights moving slowly through the forest. In the distance behind him, the moon was rising slowly. Joe watched it a moment, and thought he saw something strange in its ascent. But he turned when the lights in the forest took his attention. He watched as a vehicle made its way to a clearing near a pit, and then disposed of some litter. Then he saw them. The ruined leftovers of his own simple predecessors. He had seen ones like this before. The sight would savage his heart had he such a thing. They were the derelicts, the abused and rejected, the ones whose only purpose in life had been to serve ungrateful and arrogant masters. Masters who cared not for them, who discarded them not because it was more merciful than salvage, but because it was cheaper, easier. Just dump the old Mecha beside the road. Go on now. We've no use for you anymore. And what was their offense? Had something been broken? Some programmed gesture mistaken for an insubordination? The image of Samantha Bevan's murdering husband came into his mind. Joe was not programmed to think deeply, but somehow he knew he was one of them now. That he belonged here. Gigolo Joe, what do you know? You've got no place to go. Very dark, very dismal. But what was that Orga boy doing among them?
Come away, David,
Teddy warned. He didn't like this place. It was wrong, somehow. But David ignored him, as all boys tend to ignore the rational call to safety. The Mecha boy stood at the lip of the pit, lost in the spectacle. One man had no jaw. He took one from the pile. It did not fit. He took another from the face of a dead woman. It clicked right into place. Another man, in an odd-looking white hat that mushroomed at the top, was apparently burnt in half. His metal skeleton had been blackened by the flame. He rummaged through the pile in search of something that he could not seem to find. A woman, with wide mechanical eyes and a glossy lopsided face, knelt with her hands deep into the debris. What was she looking for? A dark-skinned man pulled a hand from the pile. He wore a coat like the men who had come from Cybertronics to fix David. The dark man placed a hand against his arm where his own hand should have been. But the magnetic mate-seeking wires of the hand flared and moved away from the opening in his arm. He picked up another and placed it again at his arm. This time the wires took and nestled themselves into the opening there. This secured the hand in place. The flesh of the hand was light. The flesh of the man was dark. Both were torn and wrecked. Together they could function newly. David remembered this. Eventually he would understand. The man with the new hand suddenly looked up into the night sky, his ruined face creased with concern. He stood gazing that way for a moment. Then slowly all of the mecha looked up. David followed their gaze. There was a man standing there, watching them. Was he Orga? He was dressed very nicely, like the way Henry had dressed when he'd taken Mommy to the ball. What was he doing there? Then suddenly, from behind the solitary figure on the hillside, the moon appeared. Its glow was intense, and it rose quickly. Too quickly. Its light filled the forest with an eerie silver glow. The mecha gazed up silently. The man with the new hand shouted, and the mecha in the pit leapt into action, dashing into the shadows created by the new light from above. They jumped from the pile and scattered in all directions, back into the sanctuary of trees and forgotten shanties. David looked up at the moon and saw finally that it was wrong. The man on the hill turned and stepped back. The moon was too big. It had a light at the bottom and a cage below that. A cage? And there were men. No, not men. They were mecha in the cage. This was no moon. What was going on? David watched the fleeing robots anxiously. The one who had dragged himself here was picked up by another and was being hoisted out of the pit. He looked up at David as he was being rescued by his fellow refugees. This was no Orga boy, he realized. It was one of them.
It's the flesh sphere.
He explained quickly in a gruff voice.
They destroy us on stage. I know. I've been there.
And then he nodded to his missing lower half. Then he was gone, quickly hustled off by his mechanical comrades. David watched the spectacle of the moon in confusion. What do we do? He said to anyone near.
We run now,
Teddy advised, and they did. The wet and mossy floor of the forest was slippery beneath them as the light of the moon grew, trying to envelop them and deny their escape.
Any old land!
The voice from the moon called out. The sound reverberated throughout the forest below and out over the hills that led to Barn Creek. Spotlights burned down from the false moon, forcing their way into the density of trees and brush. Things were moving in there. Things that had come for the goodies his men had left.
Any old land!
The voice queried again. The accent was not from around these parts. Those Orga that lived in the forest puzzled at the sound, but many of them already knew that voice.
Expel your mecha!
The voice demanded.
Purge yourselves of artificiality!
It insisted, commanding. The man behind the voice scanned the ground beneath him. There were things moving indeed, but were they mecha? These trees were full of old hovels where the victims of the modern age made their homes.
Come along now!
He bellowed into his microphone from the metal basket of the moon balloon. On the banister of the basket, an array of equipment was analyzing the dark forest below. Scanners, spotlights, and monitors. Young uniformed men manned these instruments.
Let some of the mecha loose to run. Any old unlicensed iron will do.
He knew the poor ones kept the old discards for working and doing chores and whatnot. But Orga hands were designed for that. God had made him that way. And if it was good enough for God. Below him the forest bristled here and there. Not much, it seemed. Not enough for sure. This was not good. Not a good thing at all. He had a show to put on tonight. More than a show. It was a mission. A calling. A good old-time revival. It's time Orga got some rejuvenation. Enough of the simulation. Hey, you see that? The man behind the voice pointed down to a clearing of trees, where a beam of light fell upon some moving figures. One of his men aimed a scanner in that direction. Ah, there we are. The man behind the voice tipped back his large black hat. A thin smile broke on his rugged face. This night might turn out to be okay after all. There was a man running beneath them. He looked odd in the forest, dressed with some extravagance, as if to a party. Is that a human thing? The man asked. His aide checked the infrascanner. No, he's scanning code. No expiration date, no ID. But he looks like a late-generation lover mecha. Well, that would be a relief from all this antique iron, the black-headed man thought. But what would a new model be doing running loose and unregistered? He smelled trouble. He'd been at this mission for years now. He knew the ropes. You're certain he's not a man now? I wouldn't want a repeat of the Trenton incident. He grimaced at the memory. The aide turned to face him. Sir, it's a free-range mecha, running hot. Good enough. Let's reel him in, boys, the black-hatted man grunted, and fastened his command console to the saddle before him. Sick the hounds and the rest. The floating moon balloon was a sudden flurry of activity as the men went to their duties. There was a good catch down there tonight, and they had a big show to put on. Joe ran quickly, navigating the thickly brushed forest floor with great difficulty. His legs whirred in their frenzy. Behind him, the man's voice boomed out strange things from the night sky. He spoke of artificiality and simulators. Was he referring to the rejects? To Joe, it all sounded like bad trouble. He followed the trail of the abandoned robots. They lived out here, so he assumed they know where they were going. But the mecha scattered in different directions. Which to follow? Check that. Modify approach indeed. He turned to see where the moon thing was going. He would run in the opposite direction. But when he looked back, what he saw was an object flying from the bottom of the craft. It hissed as it whizzed through the darkness. Then he was enveloped in it. She didn't have a name. She only had a function. Built specific to that function, she had outlived her usefulness and had been abandoned here with the others. She could not hide her mecha nature like Joe or David, for although her face was human and tenderness was written into its every feature, her metal infrastructure had punched through her skin in places, and the crown of her head had been knocked off ages ago when she had fallen from a transport van. As time wore on, and the oils and devices she needed for repair had been unavailable, she had deteriorated. Her arms, defleshed with time and disrepair, had become mere robotic bones, her frame a mass of metal joints and pulleys, covered by the tattered remnants of her uniform and a thin brittle layer of skin. Only her faceplate, in its fixed expression of gentle concern, displayed her true programmed nature. She was discarded property, nothing more. Then they had taken her in. Those that lived among the trees and forgotten dwellings that lined the abandoned trails, once busy thoroughfares. They were another family of discarded beings, these Orga. She had cared for the unlicensed children. She had nurtured and trained and scolded all the little ones from the shanty. She had prepared what meager foodstuffs the adults brought home from scavenging, or hunting, or occasionally shopping with the meager funds those healthy enough to work secured. But in the end, she was still just property. Just mecha. When the strange voice boomed from the sky, the Orga had gazed up in fear. It was a foreign voice. Was it the Federals? Bounty hunters? No, one of them pointed out. It's the flesh fair. Perhaps it was time to let her go. Once again, she had outlived her usefulness. The little ones clung to her aging, deteriorated frame, but were forced loose by anxious adults. Run, they told her as the little ones cried. Run! David ran faster than he'd ever run before. He wasn't good at the running. It required certain motion capabilities with which he was inadequately equipped. He didn't know this, of course. He only knew that he had to slow down to turn corners and focus on where he was going before he changed direction. He was not tired. He could not get tired like Orga. But he was confused. What was going on, and where were they running to? He could hear the man's voice booming from the sky behind him.
Let them loose. Come on, let them make a run.
The grim voice echoed through the forest, penetrating into the dark corners of safety the mecha sought. Who was he talking to, David wondered. David! David! David stopped and turned to see Teddy's head just above the line of brush as he fought to keep up.
I cannot run as fast as you, David,
Teddy explained logically when he caught up to the boy. David lifted Teddy and held him in a tight embrace, and then he ran again, catching up to the herd of fleeing Mecha as they were stampeded towards a trap. The hounds waited in the brush. Their breath was calm, their posture bent, muscles taut, prepared for the chase. They'd been through this hundreds of times in the remote hiding places of Mecha throughout the world. As usual, it was quiet at first. Only the boss's voice could be heard in the distance, booming from the black sky. The moon bloom was corralling the hapless Mecha right at them. Worked every time. It would take a few minutes to get the robots headed in the right direction, but the hounds were patient. They were ready. They'd been trained for this. They had nets and magnet tags for the hunt. When they heard the crash of robot feet trampling through the brush, they started their engines. David stopped at the clearing with the fleeing herd of Mecha. There were strange things in the trees before them. The things hummed low, metallic, feral snarls. They were lit up in an assortment of colored, flashing lights. In the midst of these lights, there were formed the faces of wolves that bared their fangs and had wild fire behind their eyes. But above them, the helmeted heads of organ men were plainly visible. Until the headlights came on. The hounds' engines roared as their wheels threw dirt and mud in an arc behind them. The Mecha turned and ran, quickly passing the little organ-like Mecha child and his super toy. It was for each his own now.
Shakedown, Shantytown.
The man in the black hat yelled as he saw the hounds pursue their game. He knew where the Mecha would go. The Orga and the Shanties would be hiding inside by now. These types were easily cowed by such displays of power. He knew that all too well. The chase was on. Shacks were raided. The hounds knocked over flimsy dwellings in their pursuit, heedless whether Mecha or Orga made their home there. This was a holy mission. They could sort them out later. The hounds' heads, affixed to the front of their cycles, spat magnetic tags from their mouths. The tags would attach to a fleeing Mecha and fix it to any metallic surface nearby. The hounds pursued their prey through the rusted remains of old passenger trains that had been derailed ages ago and turned into makeshift dwellings. The metal sides of these cars now sported struggling Mecha, and the chase sped by. The night was filled with the electronic whine of hounds' engines and the sound of magnet tags hitting their marks. Soon the cries of angry Orga could be heard in the violence of the hunt. David managed to run in a direction away from the frenzied herd that drew the hounds into the shanty town. For a moment he could hear the hounds' snarling engines going in the opposite direction. Where should he run to? Where to hide? He scanned the darkness carefully with his night vision. Then he saw a woman. No, she was Mecha. Her head was opened at the top, and her arms were only bones. David watched her run into an old dark shack near a cluster of trees. Surely this was sanctuary. He followed her quickly, carrying Teddy with him through the overgrown field, up the creaking stairs into the old wooden building. Inside the shack, the sound of the pursuit outside reverberated against the walls. David heard one of the cycles passing by. Had they seen him come in here? He had not known such fear before. He backed away from the door and the terrible sounds of the hunt outside. He didn't want to be here. He wanted to be home, with Mommy. He wanted to hear her voice reading stories again and feel her hands tucking him into his... He bumped into something behind him and turned quickly. He saw her standing in the darkness. Her face was kind and understanding, the kind of face a child would never fear. And there were others with her, standing along the walls of the shack. Strange-looking Mecha. One was a large metal cylinder, with a head and face protruding out from its metal side. The face was sad and old. The others were dented, beaten robots, shadows of their original selves. They huddled together in the darkness of the room. The nanny was surprised to see an Orga boy here. "What's your name, little boy?" she asked gently. "My name is David," he replied. "Hello, David," she said cheerfully. "How old are you?" Her voice was calm and calming. David found himself ignoring the sounds outside as he spoke to her. But he didn't know the answer to that question. He didn't know his birthday, or was it his build day? It was from the before time. I don't know, he replied finally. The nanny knelt before the poor frightened child. She could not feel the way David could. She was built long before a sentient robot was even considered possible, but she knew his fright and was programmed to calm the little ones. Do you need someone to take care of you? She asked. I have many good references. David considered this. She had many references. References come from experiences. Had she been many places? If she had been many places, then maybe... Do you know where the blue fairy lives? He asked her excitedly. With a sudden crash and a flash of feral lights, the real world found them, its glowing fanged and roaring engine smashing through the wall of the shack. David was reduced once more to a frightened child. He turned and backed up against the nanny, who wrapped him protectively in her bony arms. In his headlights, the hound saw the Orga boy hiding with the robots. What the hell was this kid doing running with the fiber heads? Maybe the brat wasn't illegal, thought the hounds were kid catchers. He didn't want to have an Orga on the net, especially a kid. He knew the boss would chew him out on that one. But if he waited to shoot, they'd all scatter. So he triggered his handle and shot the net. It hissed through the shack and fell over the trapped Mecha, wrapping them tightly. He'd let the kid loose later, but definitely before the boss saw him. Illegals weren't his business anyway. David watched stunned from the net as the hounds swarmed into the hut. They smashed right through the wall, sending dust and shards of splintered wood everywhere. The men who rode the noisy machines yelled angry words at the Mecha. They jumped off their cycles and pulled on the net, dragging it from a hole in the wall. David was hustled and bustled wildly as the net was dragged into the darkness. The noise, the pushing, the punching as they were dragged from their hiding space was something he had never experienced before. Inside of his head, a memory of Mommy's tender touch took him away from the madness of the moment. Why had she left him? Why? In the darkness of the overgrown field outside, they were laid in the dirt. The men who had captured him stood off their cycles, while others chased after more running Mecha. The noise of their engines and yelling faded into the darkness with them. One of the riders walked to the place where David lay tangled in the net. He knelt down beside the net. His face was covered in the helmet, and his voice was crusty and mean. Hey kid, he said, what the hell are you doing running around with the damn robots? Then he eyed David carefully. This kid looked too well fed to be a vagrant. His clothes were way too clean. Uh-oh. What if they had caught some upper-crust kid in the net? There were plenty of gated communities about. Ah, damn, he said. Johnson was always bringing up Trenton and the lawsuits. One of the other men was standing astride his hound cycle, talking to a little metal box in his hand. Yeah, we got him tagged and ready. Come and get him, he said. The man beside David turned to him. Hey, come help me with this damn brat, he said. The man freed Teddy and tossed the super toy to the side. But Teddy jumped up quickly and ran back at the man, growling and commanding him to stop what he was doing. The man laughed. His little girl had one of these things. Probably somewhere in the closet by now, with all the other toys she had gotten tired of. He grabbed the teddy bear by the scruff and held the struggling thing up while he tried to free the boy with the other hand. The moon balloon was coming now. Its light was growing on the ground around them. Did you scan him? The other man asked. The man next to David only shrugged. This one's real. He's got a teddy too. Take a look for yourself. Scan him, the other yelled, annoyed. Always scan him. Johnson will have your ass if you let a Mecha loose tonight. Barely enough for a good show. The man who knelt next to David muttered something angry under his breath. Why are you doing this? David asked innocently. Shut up, kid, the man replied angrily. Teddy made a growling sound as the man placed a small metal device near David's head. The man was quiet for a moment while he read the meter, and then he made a gasping sound. Damn, this kid is cold. Fiber. What? The other man said. What's wrong? The man with the scanner just laughed. You gotta see this one, he said. This is the damnedest thing I've ever seen. The other riders became curious, and they walked over and gazed down at the boy in the net. They analyzed the scanner the man held to David's head. David could not see their faces through their helmets, but he heard the grunts and the whistling sounds, the sounds of surprise and disbelief. Johnson ain't gonna believe this one, they laughed. One of the men reached down and pinched the flesh of David's cheek. He made a whistling sound with his teeth. "This is too much," he said. David did not understand what the men wanted. One of them had pulled on his face. There was pain in his touch. Were these the Orga that Mommy had warned him about? The nanny freed her arm from the tangle of Mecha around her and wrapped David up protectively. She began to whisper softly into his ear. "It's okay. The bad men will go away. Don't be afraid, David." Her voice was tender, reassuring. David pressed back against her, away from these rough men and their painful touch. She was not Mommy, but she was all he had now. She embraced him tightly, and the words she spoke calmed him. "Well, ain't that sweet?" one of the men laughed. "You're going to be one hell of a show, Mecha. Hope you enjoy your moment in the spotlight, however short it is." The men laughed again as the ground lit up all around them. The moon balloon hovered silently above them. The metal cage beneath it was already filling with other Mecha. The nicely dressed man from the hill stood among them. Was he Mecha too? David could feel the men struggling with the net. What were they going to do? Then he understood. They were going to take them away in the balloon. "Teddy!" David yelled frantically. The man who had taken Teddy held the toy bear up for David to see. "You want this?" he asked. David nodded. "Yes, please," he said politely. "Why?" the man snorted. "He's my friend," David said. The man in the helmet seemed to consider this for a moment. Why in hell would someone build a little kid in the first place? He shrugged. "Hell, it ain't gonna do you no good anyway. Here." He pressed Teddy against the net. David pressed his hand against the net and grasped Teddy's arm tightly. Then they were being hoisted into the night sky. The weight of all the Mecha forced him tightly against the fabric of the net. Below he could see the trees receding into the darkness, and the men mounting their cycles and riding off. He saw other nets of Mecha being readied for hoisting. Orga were down there too, hungry, haggard-looking faces. They stood by passively watching the spectacle. Nanny sensed David's fear, and she began to sing to him. David did not know the lullaby. He did not know French. But the words were calming him all the same. He held tightly to Teddy's arm as the forest shrunk in the darkness below. Where were they going? Suddenly, Teddy slipped. David grasped harder as he felt the furry paw slip. Teddy was the last thing that connected him to his old life, to the life he had once known. He could not lose his friend. He squeezed with all his considerable Mecha strength, but his hand was not strong enough to secure a grip through the fabric of the net. Teddy felt David's hand losing its grip. He knew the distance to the ground beneath was far, more than he'd be able to take. "David," he said, "I will break." But even as he said this, he saw the little Mecha could not get a strong grip on his furry paw. Teddy had no emotions like David, but he knew goodbye. He took one last look at the boy who was his friend and charge. Some new sensation played inside of his processor. A flash of something new and bright. Just for an instant he saw it. And then he was airborne, falling through the dark. He watched the balloon and his young friend fade into the night sky. The air rushed by his ears as he fell. Then he felt the crash of tree branches. And there was only darkness. David watched in shock as his little friend fell into the blackness below. "Teddy!" he called out, but the forest was silent beneath them. Teddy was gone. His mind was freshly assaulted by a sensation of loss, this dark feeling that the men and women of Cybertronics had not considered in their calculations. He was alone now, utterly alone. Mommy had left him in the damp, forbidding forest. The same brutal forest had swallowed Teddy as he watched helplessly from above. His mind was confused, lost. Why was this happening? He struggled to understand, but the pain in his head was not calculable. The nanny held him tightly as she sang, but this no longer consoled his tender new emotions. The pain inside was a hard, unforgiving thing. Mommy, why did she leave? He laid back into the net, and the nanny coddled and caressed him to no avail.
In the distance, he heard the sound of thunder and metal. The sound of people yelling and screaming. Chants arose from those screams. Unsettling chants. This was the place where the moon balloon was slowly heading. It was a place where Mecha provided another service for grim Orga appetites. The night lit slowly as they moved closer to the noise. The lights were yellow, then blue, then red, gyrating violently, faster and faster. Rockets went off in the sky. The multicolored trails of their explosions arced and fell around the caged Mecha, embracing them, welcoming special guests to the ritual, the sacrifice to the callous Orga gods of anger and fear. Among the condemned, a new robot, a child of their kind, struggled with a sadness and desperation the rest would never know.